Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Founders Grid, sponsored by Caper.io. Today we have Scott Case. Scott needs no introduction. He's the founding CTO of Priceline and now the CEO and founder of Upside. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, give us, so from Priceline to Upside, maybe a 1 minute conversation on that, how the journey has been.
It's been a winding, twisty one like most startups themselves. I am first and foremost an entrepreneur and have a computer science and engineering degree. And as you mentioned, I was the founding CTO of Priceline. I have done everything from running and scaling public health organizations like Malaria No More, which is a global public health organization. I'm the chairman of Network for Good, which is a software as a service platform for small and medium-sized charities, as well as a donation processing system for partners like Facebook, Google, and REI, and Patagonia, and dozens of others, where we help about 250,000 nonprofits raise about $500 million a year. And as you mentioned, I'm the the co-founder and CEO of Upside Business Travel. And so I kind of bookended so far my travel space in the Priceline days back into business travel. We started the company about 5 years ago, and it's been an interesting ride the last 6 months as fewer and fewer people were traveling for business because of the pandemic, although things are looking up at this point.
Okay, so let's go trying to keep the conversation much more relevant towards today's time. The emotion swings, the business swings, and all the swings that have been going through in the last 6 months. Roller coaster ride, I would say, with a lot of turbulence and headwinds, right? So, how has the company been coping up in the first? Let's talk about Q2, March, April, May. Whichever news you open up, things are gone, end of days, right? So what was then and how is it different now?
I think we've gone through three phases, and it's probably true for a lot of businesses. The first phase was the first month or two, where it was all about just how do we survive this, and you were getting constant feedback every hour, and so your planning horizon was measured in hours or days at best. I think by the end of April or so, we started to extend our planning horizon, like many others, through the end of the year, which kind of entered our phase two, which was all right. We've stabilized things. Now, what are the types of investments we're going to make over the short term to kind of grow our way out of the chaos of the pandemic? And then I'd say we're kind of in the third phase, which is we have a much better understanding. Our planning horizon now is extending into 2021 and 2022, and we're starting to figure out, all right, how do we win in this new environment, and what are the likely scenarios, and how do we plan for them? Our team has been incredibly resilient throughout all of this, which is really, really important for teams right now. We transitioned to being a remote organization where we were more of a central office component, and that has been an interesting both challenge. I don't think we've mastered it yet, but we are investing heavily in how to think about being a more effective remote organization, especially in a time when you can't really bring everybody together ever, or even medium-sized groups together. So that's been one of the challenges as a team that we've overcome. And then there's figuring out how to live in a world where people remain quite correctly, uneasy about traveling. We're seeing rising cases throughout the world. And so it's going to be another, we think, probably a year before things really start to pick back up. They've sort of stabilized at a 30% of what it was in 2019. And we don't think that's going to change very much for several months.
So, since at Gaper, we're very big advocates of remote work, and a lot of research and thinking has been going on how to transition remote teams from traditional office teams to remote teams, right? So, and it came with its own challenges. So let's first talk about the transition of the existing teams, keeping a balance when it comes down to the work-life balance, because for some, office used to be an escape so that they can focus more and work, right? Especially in big congested cities like New York or San Francisco, where the home spaces are small, right? The apartment living. And then the next question would be the onboarding of new team members, right? Because the how to translate the culture to them, especially, and then they're because through the office you had a proper onboarding process, but how to onboard through Zoom, get them into the culture of the team. Then the onboarding is also divided into multiple. So I have multiple questions. Let's start with the first one. Sorry.
Well, first off, I think that the critical piece is establishing and clearly having your core values as a company kind of written down, and those really don't change very much from whether you're working remotely or you have distributed teams. So that's the first piece, is you have to have those core values. And how do you make sure in the onboarding process that you are bringing people along? And really even starts before the onboarding. It starts at the time that you're interviewing people. How do you conduct yourself through those pieces? And we've adapted reasonably well to that. I think one of the biggest challenges you have is that we are not only navigating a remote workforce, but we're also dealing with distributed individuals, which for some companies, if you had distributed teams, maybe those smaller pods of people, you'd have 2, 3, 4, 5 people that would be together. So you had some connective tissue in real life. And then we have the compounding issue of being in various states of quarantine. We're all trying to limit the amount of interactions we have with people. And I think that overlay on top of it is that much more difficult for people, not just to escape someplace to be able to work productively, but also to be able to just interact with other people in the world. And so I think figuring out how to separate those elements out has been a challenge for us. I know that our team is feeling a little bit disconnected at times. And so finding ways to connect everybody back together again. I think our small teams are really connected, 3, 4, 5, 6 people you work with every day. But I think figuring out how to get those individuals connected more broadly across the organization is something that we continue to work on. And we're looking for better strategies. I think the biggest aha I've had is that trying to transport the form of what worked well in a headquarters type environment or a centralized office into the digital age isn't working. We're reimagining the entire employee experience and thinking about what were the things that worked and that we designed into the physical space, and say, well, what problems were those things solving? And then how do we solve those same problems in a digital environment? An example of that is, as you point out, someone new. Well, when you're in a physical space and someone new shows up, everybody over the course of usually 2 or 3 days notices there's just somebody new in the office. And our culture was one where you went and introduced yourself. We don't have the same visual cues that we have in a Zoom world where you can't even fit our entire team on one screen. So how do we foster more interactions where people get to introduce themselves to each other in those ways? And figuring out good strategies for that is difficult. And again, deconstructing those challenges. What's the overall employee experience? How do we deal with the pandemic overlay? How do we deal with the isolation? You're only one person by yourself working in a remote area, and that lack of team, even if it's a small team physically around you. Those are challenges that I believe we will be able to overcome, but they're definitely real.
Yeah. So last question. So I'm sorry, but my marketing team wants me to keep them within 12 minutes. So someone who's a seasoned and experienced founder like yourself, you've seen the dot-com bubble, then the 2007-8 recession, then the pandemic. So what advice would you give to young entrepreneurs who just like recently started out, maybe just before COVID or in 2019, and they've just been kind of like, they just took their flight off and they've been hit with so many multiple unvariables. So how do you navigate through that, and what 3 pieces of advice would you like to give these individuals?
Well, there's a few things. So one is the period now, let's say in the pandemic, is one that, depending on the type of business that you're in, you may need to pivot significantly in order to make it through the period, depending on the resources you have. So if you don't have enough resources to get through, let's say, the end of 2021, you really need to think about what do you need to do differently. And maybe that's accelerating some plans, maybe that's slowing things down, but you're going to need to kind of address your runway. So step one is you've got to tackle that piece. Step two is that you have to be very careful about the kinds of feedback you might be getting from your prospects or your customers in this moment. And you've got to ask yourself, what's the likelihood that any of those behaviors are going to continue past the pandemic? And you've just going to have to make some guesses, because you may, especially if you're early, get some false signals where in 2022, the behaviors that we're all exhibiting today might go away. So for example, the fact that people are spending a lot more time at home, does that continue or not? And is your product or the changes you're making to your product dependent on that? And if it is, you're going to have to be very careful, because that could mean that you end up with a shrinking market or shrinking usage in 18 months. And then I think the third thing is that this will pass. This moment in time, the experiences that we're having right now is not going to last forever. And there will be another side. And so you have to give yourself some permission, as I said earlier, on the planning horizon to think 2, 3, 4 years out, because otherwise you may make some choices now that are very short term, but you also may miss some big opportunities down the line if you can think a little further out.
Scott, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm pretty sure we could have talked for another half an hour, but thank you so much. Take care of yourself, stay safe, and all the best with Upside.
Thank you very much. You too.